Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to this panel event on experimental publishing and connected and network cultures here at the University of Reading. And this event has been convened by Ruth Blacksell and Lozana Rossenova from typography here at Reading. So my name is Sophie Hayward and I'm currently the director of the Centre for Book Cultures and Publishing here at the University of Reading. And we are delighted, really excited to be hosting this event in partnership with Ruth and Lozana. So here in the Centre, our research in book cultures and publishing is firmly multidisciplinary and multilingual. We bring together colleagues and students working in English, Spanish, French and German language publishing and book history, and colleagues across literary, languages, business departments, and also, yes, our colleagues over in typography and book design who bring expertise in all sorts of areas, and also in Latin and non-Latin texts. And we have shared interests across our centre in digital and analogue texts and digital methods in scholarship and also in book production. So it just feels really great and really exciting to see this panel event bringing together expertise across borders and disciplines. And it really is a first for us to have an event on this field, you know, talking to us about this really important field of publishing and design practice. So we're really pleased. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to my colleague Ruth Blacksell from the Centre, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Typography and Graphic Design, and she's now going to introduce this event to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, for that introduction. So I just want to say thank you to the Centre for Book Cultures and Publishing and the University of Reading for hosting the event this evening. My name's Ruth Blacksell and I'm based here at the university in the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication, as Sophie said. So by way of introduction, the idea for proposing this event with Lozana Rossenova emerged for me out of a few related things. Firstly, my interest in the ways in which typography and different forms of self-published or mainstream published document, including but not limited to books and magazines, were used by 1960s and 70s experimental writing, performance and conceptual art practices in the shift away from fixed to more subjective and fluid forms that are contingent upon dynamic, interactive and shifting contexts. This includes well-known publications from that period, such as the magazines Aspirin, 0 to 9, and the Whole Earth catalogue, as well as historically well-documented book and magazine and index works by artists like Dan Graham, Vito Acconci and Bernadette Mayer, Robert Smithson, Yoko Ono, Art and Language, and so on, where the forms and operations of the published document or record were used to create open-ended, iterative, or contingent works that, amongst other things, could subvert or sidestep the control and confines of institutional contexts. As well as looking at the printed and often text-based nature of these published works in the 60s and 70s, and the ways in which they're published and circulated, I've been interested in how they can feed into debates that arose a full 20 years later in the 1980s and 90s in editorial and typographic design discourse, when publications, most notably the Californian magazine Aymeric, started to experiment with early Apple Macintosh desktop publishing tools, and similarly interrogated ideas of fixed versus fluid form and the active reader through their typography, layout, and editorial content. I was interested in the difficulty of capturing and fully accounting for these early practices, which today, 60 years later, still require re-examination and extension to fixed form archival categorizations that remain very common in institutional libraries and collections of books, documents, and published ephemera. So in response to this, I was invited to set up a collaborative doctoral partnership in 2015 with Tate Library for research, which was eventually undertaken by Franco, who's one of the speakers tonight, to particularly consider works that are neglected, misunderstood, or left out of libraries and archives because of this need for a better account of their use of published forms. I also introduced specific research-led teaching content to the MA Communication Design programme in my department, which brought in a contemporary focus on the hybrid relations between fixed printed and dynamic digital publications and their historically conceptual underpinnings. And this has given the programme the great opportunity to connect with the practice-led doctoral research of Lozana Rossenova, and through a collaborative doctoral partnership of her own between Rhizome and London South Bank University. So before handing over to Lozana, I just want to say that it's important to note that practice and discourse around this area is interdisciplinary, and as such can be viewed and articulated through different disciplinary perspectives, often requiring and benefiting from different disciplinary vocabularies, from art, graphic or editorial design, digital media, software development, and so on. It's important to note that examples of these engagements are still commonly described as unconventional or experimental, but that such terms have also led to a sidelining or a refusal to adequately acknowledge the historical and theoretical role of these works in contributing to contemporary considerations of the forms, locations, and operations, or the network cultures that have grown up around published documents and publishing per se. So I'm going to hand over to Lozana Rossenova now to talk briefly about her own interest in convening this event and to introduce the speakers. And I look forward to coming back for some more discussion in the Q&A at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for setting up the context for us, Ruth. I hope everyone can hear me, and maybe Sophie, if you can pin me at the top, that would be great, because I'm still seeing Ruth, but maybe it's just me. Brilliant, thanks. So hi everyone, my name is Lozana, and I'm very happy for the chance to be here today and to participate in this event. The presentations today will address a range of key topics at the intersection of experimental publishing and the formation of publics, consisting of active audience participants, readers, and users, rather than passive viewers and consumers. We will draw historical connections that look to previous practices which exemplify how networks don't just happen within what we now know as the commercial internet, but can be sustained in a multitude of ways. As Ruth mentioned, I have been doing a PhD research project concerning related topics, and I have also been teaching at Reading on the MA in Communication Design course. I teach a module on experimental and hybrid publishing forms, which is concerned with the relations and shifting agencies between designers, users, and the infrastructure of online databases, public archives, and commercial platforms. I have an MA degree from this department at Reading, the typography department as well, and my degree specialized in book design. After working as a digital designer for several years, I began my PhD research at London South Bank University into design for digital cultural archive systems, working through some of the difficulties of capturing network culture within what is traditionally considered to be a fixed form, the archival database. I have just completed the PhD and will speak a bit more about it in my own presentation later today. I will also speak about the threads I draw between these seemingly quite distinct worlds of publishing and design on the one hand, and archives, network culture, software development on the other. But I also hope that these threads emerge organically throughout all the presentations of our invited panelists today. To that end, and without much further ado, I want to introduce the speakers and the running order. First up, we'll hear from Dr. Carolee Franco. In the interest of time, I will not read out her full bio, but you will see a link in the chat that my colleague Sophie would hopefully be able to post soon, that will have the full bios of all the speakers. Carolee Franco is a curator and writer working within the context of archives and publishing, with a focus on practices that emerge between text and performance. As Ruth mentioned, Karen conducted her PhD in collaboration with Tate's Library and Archive, and we'll hear more from her today on the research findings, which surface the role of women in using publication and iteration as a means to challenge established forms around writing, making art, and performance. I will be following up from Karen with a short presentation myself. Next, we'll hear from Tomislav Medak and Marcell Mars. Tom is a PhD researcher at Coventry University's Center for Post-Digital Cultures, whose research interests are in technology, capitalist development, and post-capitalist transition. Marcell is a researcher, programmer, and artist working in the fields of internet regulation, intellectual property, and open source software. Tom and Marcell are frequent collaborators and are both members of the team at multimedia institution MAMA in Zagreb, Croatia. Building on their work around amateur librarianship and custodianship of knowledge developed throughout the project Memory of the World, they will present a new conceptual and technical framework for publishing an online syllabus, which can be collectively written, referenced, and sustainably archived. Finally, Aymeric Mansoux will introduce his work with the XPub program at Piet Zwart Institute in Rotterdam. Aymeric is an artist and media researcher. He received his PhD from Goldsmiths University of London for his investigation of the techno-legal forms of social organization within free and open source-based cultural practices. Today, he will unpack the question of what making public and creating public in the age of post-digital networks means, following the proposition that experimental publishing is a means and not an end, and that it stands at the crossroads of questions of aesthetics, politics, and infrastructure. After everyone's presentations, we'll hold a panel discussion and an open Q&A session, so please stay with us for that. The session will be moderated by Ruth and myself. Please feel free to write your questions into the Q&A module on Zoom during every talk that we're going to listen to tonight. But bear in mind that we will answer the questions only in the end, and we may not be able to answer everyone's questions, but we'll try our best to answer as many as possible within the time that we have. And some of you may have noticed we have disabled the chat for tonight simply because we have quite a lot of attendees. And it will be easier for us to manage if we are getting all of the communication in just one single channel, which is the Q&A box. And so I think unless Ruth wants to add any further logistical notes, I will stop sharing the screen with the running order, and I will hand over to Karen for her presentation. Thanks very much.
Hi everyone, I'm hoping that you can see my screen. Please can someone let me know?
Yes, we can. I can see it. Hopefully
that's great.
Works for everyone. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks to everyone, to Sophie, to Ruth, and to Lozana, and everyone else who's participating today. I'm really slightly nervous about the size of the audience, but it's really great to be able to present as part of this group. As Ruth and Lozana mentioned, I did my PhD at Reading, and having finished last year, I've had a kind of slightly separate experience of doing the Viva online and now obviously presenting predominantly online over the last year. So it's kind of nice to regroup in this virtual sense and talk about some of the material that I worked with over the 4 years that I was writing the thesis. So this is kind of a return to material that that is kind of encapsulated within this body of research that I produced with Tate's collection, and so it's quite specific in certain senses. But I think a lot of what I wrote about also opens out sort of issues that are endemic within the relationships between artist publishing as a format. As a format for experimentation within artistic production, as much as it is a format for curatorial production, and then obviously its relationship to collecting institutions and the ways in which they understand those materials. So I'm going to start by reading a sort of short passage from my introduction in my PhD, and then I'll talk through some of the materials that I investigated sort of in depth that highlight some of the relationships between iteration and production, but also I guess a kind of methodology for understanding how we might describe materials that have not been written about previously, and how they affect our understandings of how artists made publishing in a period sort of between the sort of mid to late 60s and the mid 70s. So as Ruth mentioned, I responded to a series of questions that she would pose through this collaborative doctoral partnership. So I'm kind of framing my work in that sense. So looking at how artist books should be reconsidered, the recognition of works that have shifted into more expansive and increasingly digital publishing contexts. So how do these works sort of necessitate a revision to conventional methodologies of curation and display, of archiving, of cataloguing and reproduction? So I'm reviving the sort of connections between artists' writing, poetry and performance formats as represented through a variety of magazines and journals, as well as other types of provisional materials. So looking predominantly at the excerpt or the activity of republishing certain types of writing within publications themselves, examining these iterations at each point of publication to allow a series of sort of alternative histories and networks to emerge, and examining how they contribute to a contemporaneous interrogation of intersectional narratives that reject singular conceptions of work for ones that speak to a heterogeneous community that problematizes the frameworks of contemporary collections. And this comes from the separation of publishing into library collections, which was established through the rapid proliferation of artist books as a kind of post-1960s object, which has made a lot of artist publishing subject to to library definitions rather than art definitions. And so obviously our understanding of what these materials might mean when we come to research them is then dictated by the ways in which they are catalogued and described, or not, as the case may be. So I'm interested in how these types of layering of understandings beyond an art historical one complicates our understanding of what those materials might mean when we come to reassess them or assess them at this contemporaneous point. So the works that I examined sort of takes on this very basic need of description in the first point. So if discourse in the 1960s was an attempt to define it within the context of art librarianship, then we should be acknowledging the relationship that the library and archive has, you know, in the context of contemporary curation as well, on our understandings of what these things are now. So we're quite familiar with the context of the book as artwork or the book as exhibition, but in some respects we also need to think about the book as a rehearsal space, or the book as a site of performance. But those performances might be contingent on certain types of iteration themselves. And so they're not fixed in any particular type of designation, even at the point of publishing itself. So from these kind of complicated and quite interweaving spaces, we also find that these works are a site of community for experimentation and location that also describes a network of production that occurs at a time where, again, historical narratives tend to focus on certain dominant formats of understanding of the relationship between artist publishing and conceptualism, for example, that sidelines and I guess refuses in some respects the space of narrative writing, the space of performance, and the space of feminism within certain types of documentation. So underpinning this research was this kind of methodology that I developed from my own personal experience of working as a digital archivist with bookworks, which was the kind of starting point for this line of inquiry, but also my work as a curator. And I'm very interested, I guess, in curating feminist practices from which a lot of materials are located within archive collections, whether they're personal or institutional. And I complement this kind of investigation with the theoretical work of practitioners such as Karen Barard and Maria Tambuku, who position the narrative capabilities of interactions as described through the encounters that emerge between phenomena, documents, and therefore by extension words, as instructed, scored, or spoken. The theoretical possibility offered by Barad's classification of entanglement within her theory of agential realism provides the thread from which my analysis extended from. Understanding matter and material as iterative, co-constituted, and inherently entangled. So moving on from that, I'm going to look at some, she says, some books. So I'm going to talk predominantly here about the practice of Carolee Schneemann, who was one of the chapters in my thesis, because I think the examples that she provides through her practice are kind of quite exemplary of an artist who's predominantly known for performance, group performance and solo performance, but her work stems from a particular type of inquiry that is located in writing. And that inquiry spans her entire span of her practice. So she was publishing in such works as Something, which is an experimental poetry journal. She first published Something in 1965, and it was a kind of a grouping of materials that related to her performance, Meet Joy. So for Schneemann, publishing in the first instance provided a space for sort of locating documentation of performance, and quite specifically sort of score writing and notes that would relate to those performances. This can be seen, I guess, more visually in this example from Icon magazine, which is another poetry magazine edited by Susan Sherman, in which Schneemann published a quite long article relating to her multimedia installation and performance Snows, which contains a lot of photography, but it also the writing moves between a kind of score, documentation and reflection that kind of collides a lot of types of registers of writing, and her writing predominantly does this across a lot of different types of media, and figuring out how to think through what these types of texts mean in relation to publishing, I found a kind of key resource within my thesis, because her work kind of troubles the relationship between I guess like key texts, because all her texts are continuous. There's always a space of she's always editing and excerpting her texts and republishing them. So trying to talk about how to write a bibliography of her work is extremely difficult. And it made me think that there's quite a strong relationship between this kind of methodological approach and the ways in which experimental publishing kind of moves into becoming a space of performance documentation, but also performance itself, as we can see in this example of Streetworks, which was a kind of small sideline pamphlet that was produced with the last issue of 0 to 9. So Streetworks was a series of performances on the streets on Saturday, March the 15th, 1969. And the pamphlet kind of contained materials that are gathered by the participating artists as part of their work. Some of them just reproduced scores, some of them reproduced materials as part of their performances, which were then published, of which you can see some examples here from the artist Lil Pickard and the poet Anne Waldman. And what particularly interested me about this was the ways in which they had related their materials through handwritten documentation, which again is at this point in time is actually quite unusual. I think we have, again, a kind of understanding of conceptual documents being broadly types, even if they are mimeographed, which is obviously how 0 to 9 was produced. It was a very cheaply produced magazine, done sort of in the back room after work had finished, and so it's you know, it's hand cranked mimeograph materials, but which is made even more provisional by this intervention of handwriting within the magazine itself. And looking again then at Aspen 6A, which is an often overlooked issue of Aspen. It came out as a free insert that was posted out to subscribers along with issue 5 and 6, which is the sort of seminal Brian O'Doherty White Cube edition. Aspen 6A, in kind of stark difference, is a cheaply Xerox produced collection of fragments of performance put together and sealed in an envelope with the details on the top. So you can see that in the top left-hand corner. It was kind of initiated by John Hendricks and Jean Tochet, who would later form the Guerrilla Art Action Group. And Schneemann was someone who also participated in this project called Manipulations, which was a series of off-site performance installations. And so the only kind of record really of any of the actions that occurred during this time through this very provisional set of documentations. And again, Schneemann uses this as a way of producing a piece of writing that again troubles this relationship between the idea of sort of score and document. And the layout again formalizes a certain type of approach that you would be more familiar with in kind of experimental poetry and experimental writing, in that kind of literary writing scene. So maybe more equated with writers like David Antin, for example, of whom Schneemann was friends with. So we can see that she's inserting her writing into a particular type of genre, as much as it's also troubling this kind of relationship between publishing as a kind of live document. And then when we move into the late 60s, she publishes a text called Parts of a Body House. And this is the focal point for my investigation within my thesis. It's a text that she published 5 times across 5 different publications. And the ways in which these publications produce and display this material completely reshapes our understanding of what the text might mean, given our engagement with it at any one or multiple times. So it first comes out in Caterpillar, which is an experimental magazine, predominantly poetry, edited by the poet Clayton Eshelman. So it comes out in July 1968. Here you can see the ways in which the layout attributes a certain type of passage verse visualization to it. This followed the typescript that she produced herself. So it's just a kind of direct translation of her own work. It's not reset in any particular way. It carries the date stamps of the time that she wrote the work as a durational text. It's a fictional reimagining of an installation that was never produced. It's a score. It's also a piece of fiction. So it moves again between lots of different types of relativity to a reader. It instructs you to follow a route through the parts of a house, which are also sort of activated by your engagement with the technologies within them. But we can see here that there's a relationship between the ways in which she's working with the texts from Divisions and Rubble, which was the piece that she produced for Aspen, and then this piece here as it's reproduced in Caterpillar, which then is reproduced again in 1969 in an anthology publication called Fantastic Architecture. And this is where we can really see the relationship between the designer and the artists being completely sort of different in terms of their interpretation of the text. So this was reset and designed by Ruth and Dick Higgins, and they also put a backdrop of Carolee Schneemann, a photograph that was lifted from something else, and they literally made her a centerfold in this reproduction. And they also reordered the text. It's not been possible to find whether she actually signed this off. Unfortunately, a lot of those types of conversation are never really to be found in archives, unfortunately. But she was critical of the ways in which it was reproduced. And sadly, this publication, because it was published with Something Else Press, had a very large circulation. And so this is predominantly the ways in which people would have received that text had they engaged with it at the time. And actually, Fantastic Architecture has been republished by Primary Information. So you can now buy it for a fairly cheap price. The third time it's reproduced is in Parts of Body House book, which is a book that she produced in the UK with the publisher Boges Press, which is how I came to find the text in the first place. Boges Press's archive is at Tate, and was one of the predominant resources that I researched during my time writing my PhD. So in relationship with her own work, the text sort of formulates itself into much more into a kind of narrative script. It's unadorned on the page, which is in complete contrast to the rest of the book, which uses a lot of overprinting, hand stamps, hand interventions through drawings and stains, overprinting, lots of other types of hand letterpress techniques. The text here is completely devoid of any ornamentation whatsoever, which I think conveys a certain other type of seriousness in relation to how she considered her writing herself. She describes it as the kind of core of her practice. And then it's republished by Boges Press themselves, who just translate the stencil. And this is for the first issue of Schmuck, which was their assemblage magazine, which came out a couple of months after she produced the book in 1972. So it's republished 3 times in the UK. So in her own artist book, in Schmuck, and then in a very sort of small press poetry magazine called Earthship, which was edited by an Australian poet called Chris Hemmensley. So this comes out in August, and Schneemann's had quite a long correspondence relationship with Hemmensley, and she contributed to a couple of other editions of Earthship. So her relationship to this text spans, you know, the kind of US poetry scene, into Fluxus with Something Else, into her own work, and then out towards sort of Fluxus again, and then back into the poetry scene. So you can see the kind of the route that this material takes through these points of iteration. And this kind of approach really interested me because I think it speaks to a kind of network of connections that are almost impossible to reproduce if you're trying to think about it in relationship to researching something and understanding it online. And so this kind of problem of annexation of materials across all these different library and archive collections that even just demonstrated through this one text, and that's just one text that she iterated. There are so many that she also kind of reproduced over her time. Sorry, Ruth, I'm going to get to, this is the last slide. That maybe think about this kind of methodological process of the research and our interventions into understanding the kind of layering that type of approach to publishing exemplifies. And so through conversations with Lozana and other people who have also inputted into the digital archive of artist publications, we inputted the information relating to this text into the database to produce this visualization, which begins to sort of chart the network of associations between the books and the individuals, and also the text itself, which is something for me is a kind of goal of research accessibility, which is, you know, being able to look at the individual items within a magazine as a way of understanding and tracing connections through material as it relates itself through different types of publications. I'm guessing, am I over time now?
Yes, a little bit, Karen.
Okay,
if you just
I will
like
leave
one
it
or
there.
two more sentences, and then, yeah.
Well, okay, just to quickly say that, you know, this is also found in works by Lucy Lippard, who also is a prolific writer, and Constance Dujon, who were the other two main case studies within my thesis itself. So if anyone wants to ask me about those two practitioners as well, there's also material that relates to them more broadly, but perhaps we can talk about that in the panel discussion. So I'll leave it there, and I will try to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much.
Right, so I will just go on next, and if I will try to not go too much over time, but please, Ruth or Sophie, feel free to interrupt me if I am being very slow. Thanks, Karen. Your presentation was fascinating, but we are a little bit like pressed for time, unfortunately, and I hope we can continue some of these questions into the Q&A afterwards. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. As I mentioned briefly in the introduction, I want today, in about 15 minutes, which is a difficult task, so bear with me. I will try to draw out some of the threads between the historical contexts that inform the development of certain experimental practices and their relation to the creation of new forms of publics, active readers or users, and network communities. To do that, I will talk about the concepts of recursive publics, informed users, and informed or reformed designers. So there are many points to start with, and Karen obviously provided one point of entry into this discussion. I will try to start at a different place, and hopefully we can end somewhere where we can have a common conversation. But yeah, basically there's many histories to draw upon at the intersection of publishing, networks, and communities. And I think the Whole Earth Catalog is also one good point to start. Whole Earth Catalog, or WEC, as I'm gonna be referring to it in the next couple of slides, just to be short. WEC is many things, primarily an American countercultural magazine and product catalog published by Stuart Brand in the late 60s and early 70s. My choice to start here is partly serendipitous, partly personal. I encountered WEC during my MA studies. At the time, the main point of interest for me was the book object, the design, the typesetting, partly the innovative crowdsourcing of the content and the distribution methods. Only much later, while researching early net history for my PhD, would I learn of the important role the project played in early networked communities and how many users, scholars, hackers consider it a precursor to the internet, from the clever ways of simulating a form of proto-hyperlinks by creating visually interesting reference points across pages in the catalog, to the content being essentially user-generated, much like contemporary social media. And just to point out, I'm using here not any single image to represent this multifaceted project, but rather a view of the results for this publication when I search for it in Google Images. So the serendipitous part in choosing this project to start with is me browsing on Twitter one evening while still conceptualizing this event with Ruth back in, I think, March, and happening upon a tweet by the Internet Archive. So the Internet Archive is a vast online resource for public domain books, music, games, software, and more. And the tweet pointed out that eWEC, or the electronic version of the Whole Earth Catalog, can be accessed in the archive via software emulation. That is the capability to run old software on contemporary machines. Oops, sorry. This much later digital version of WEC, dating from 1989, and at the time distributed via CD-ROM, followed many of the original principles of the printed publication, including the notion of the active public, reader, user, who is part of this larger community connected via the key demand or call to action, access to tools. But the printed WEC and its later electronic version certainly wasn't the only hybrid project at the time that can be considered a precursor to significant socio-technical developments that would shape the media and communication landscape in the 80s and 90s. It is beyond my scope to trace a complete lineage, but I do want to highlight the role of many women, often sidelined, in the early innovations and technological practices that would lead to what we now understand as the internet, a networked community and a user as well. This wonderful book by Claire L. Evans is my second entry point in thinking through the themes of the panel today. Not only, I think, does it connect to some of the core thesis ideas presented by Karen in terms of the role of women in all of these developments, but it also covers many of the untold histories featuring women and other underrepresented groups operating in San Francisco and other parts of the US around the same time as the whole Earth community was developing too. Evans tells the stories of women involved in the BBS scene, that's bulletin board systems, a form of local network systems, which became vital hubs of connection prior to the wider spread of the internet. Stuart Brandt was also involved in The Well, a BBS manifestation for the whole Earth community. But Evans focuses her story on women like Nancy Ryan and Stacey Horn, who extended the reach of these networks, with Horn starting an independent East Coast node in New York. Crucially, with this book, Evans draws attention to the user and blurs the sharp lines between makers and users, who gets to push technologies forward and who gets to get credit for it. My last entry point for the discussion today is this book, 2 Bits by Christopher Kelty. In mapping out the cultural history of the free software movement, Kelty develops this, I think, pretty helpful concept, the recursive public. Quote, a public that is visually concerned with the material, that is vitally concerned with the material and practical maintenance and modification of the technical, legal, practical, and conceptual means of its own existence as a public. It is a collective independent of other forms of constituted power and is capable of speaking to existing forms of power through the production of actually existing alternatives. Free software was going back to the free software has roots going back to the 70s and is significant in the discussion today, not only because it is deeply tied with the histories of the personal computer, bulletin board networks, intellectual property laws, and eventually the World Wide Web, but also because of its role in the establishment of networked social movements, of groups of users, activists, hackers, sometimes designers too, who respond collectively to the challenges and opportunities of the above phenomena by creating new tools, methods, and modes of practice. And I'm sure we'll hear much more about this actually from the presentations following mine. With this ethos of active participation and intervention in the network, I will now briefly speak about my own PhD practice and research. The project was set up as a collaborative partnership with Rhizome and my home institution, London South Bank University. Founded in 1996 by artist Mark Tribe, Rhizome is a born digital art organization based in New York. Not unlike some of the projects discussed so far, Rhizome was initially a community hub centered around an online mailing list. Since 1999, Rhizome maintains one of the largest online archives of born digital art, the Artbase. The archive started out as a community initiative from the mailing list, with submissions open to anyone, and it now has over 2,200 works, hosting primarily net art, but also works that employ media such as software, moving image, games, and more. As an artistic movement, net art emerged in the 90s, but has a long lineage of connections to earlier avant-garde and anti-institutional performance and publishing-related art practices. What is more, net art challenges the notion of artworks as single, self-contained objects. And I think here is where I can draw some connections with Karen's work and her ideas of iteration around the publications coming out much earlier, 60s and 70s. So with net art, in order to be performed and experienced, those works depend on alignments between hardware and software environments, network protocols, and crucially, an active user, Without user interaction, the works cannot be rendered at all. With my PhD research, I aim to unpack the questions of user access in born digital archives, and more specifically, how to support informed user interaction and potential for intervention in the archive through a situated design practice. When I first encountered the latest version of Artbase in 2016, there was little context around the artworks available in the archive for users to access. And the interface and the underlying data structure for the archive was not able to answer questions such as who was involved in the artwork production, maybe more collaborators than just a single artist listed in one single field of metadata. How did the work evolve over time? Did the work change because of updates in the technical protocols of the web or browsers that users had to use to access the web? So reimagining the Artbase interface in a way that could better support and make clearly visible to users the complex socio-technical context around the works required more than a redesign involving surface-level branding and styling. It necessitated considering how a digital archive system for born digital materials works and for whom. Instead of thinking of the Artbase interface as a top layer in a conventional stack consisting of software and hardware, it was more productive to consider the archive as a network of relations between users. And by users, I include staff in the organization, as well as artists, programmers, academic involved in the broader community around the organization. And so the relationships extend between these different agencies and the digital infrastructure as well, which has its own agency in the network of relations. The network condition complicated the redesign of the interface, but also opened opportunities to rethink the agency of users within digital institutional environments. And conveniently for this presentation today, after many years in the making, Rhizome just launched the newly redesigned version of the Artbase this week. So it's now available for anyone to browse and test out the new design and information architecture, and I can drop a link in the chat afterwards if you want to explore this. I want to highlight a few key points about the new design that work towards supporting more informed user interactions. First, we use the linked open data environment, which is a specific type of database infrastructure which allows the design of a flexible ontology that can better describe the contextual data around the artworks with a level of depth and richness not possible with more traditional systems. Next, we use new interaction design patterns that allow users to better understand the underlying data architecture and the new terms we're using. Also, how these terms are actually manifested in connecting the data in useful ways. We have developed a user guide materials that allow users to query data in the archive and visualize it, as shown in this example screenshot here. Finally, we use an open source software to achieve all this called Wikibase. Our Wikibase does not only power the linked open data environment of the archive, but it also connects the archive to a rich tradition of open knowledge management. Wikibase is part of the Wikimedia software ecosystem, which focuses on collaborative and openly editable software environments. An example of the most popular Wikimedia product, which I'm sure everyone here would be familiar with, is Wikipedia. While Wikipedia is far from an ideal environment, and it has its many flaws and biases, the social and cultural aspects of free and open source software and the attendant communities are significant when thinking through active and informed publics who not only understand the implications of their interactions with an information system, but are also able to impact that system in meaningful ways. And it is also worth mentioning that the project Karen referenced in the last slide of her talk, the DAP, a project I also collaborated on in terms of the data structure there and the technical infrastructure, it also uses the same software, Wikibase, and shares in the benefits of archiving complex digital and hybrid materials. I also want to highlight the activities carried out with users throughout my research practice as foundational to addressing the question of user agency in the archive. We engaged users through surveys, interviews, and co-design workshops that involved working with the Wikibase software and starting to think through the questions of how this linked open data environment might become legible to users accustomed to more traditional archive interfaces. The point of these collaborations with users wasn't to study or observe from some kind of external position of the designer as omnipresent expert, but it was very much to become part of the community, to blend the sharp edges between the roles of designer, user, and institutional stakeholder. Additionally, the research process involved frequent communication with various open source communities involved in the software we were using. This image is from the Wikibase Summit, co-organized by Rhizome and Wikimedia and hosted in the New Museum in New York in 2018. These community engagements were crucial in creating a sustainable environment for the development of custom features that we needed in our interpretation of Wikibase. Since open source software cannot be developed in isolation or a silo, it can only work within a collective and collaborative endeavor. I documented the findings of all of these research activities in a portfolio site and a series of reports. With this documentation, I hope to make a lot of the behind-the-scenes activities accessible to other designers as well as institutional stakeholders. Too often, institutional design projects are done behind closed doors, and even if extensive work with users was conducted, the only thing made public in the end is a polished and opaque interface. Instead of seeking a perfect end solution with the art-based redesign, we wanted to leave it open to iteration and feedback from users, which, thanks to the flexible software architecture, is actually possible to act upon and adopt in practice. With this, I want to segue into the final part of my talk, which will cover just in like 2 minutes my teaching work in Reading, which I think is relevant, unless Sophie and Ruth interrupt me if I'm going a little bit too much over. But I think I need like 2 minutes and it'll be fine. So I started teaching in Reading in 2017, building on practical experience in the design industry, as well as independent work as an amateur publisher at the time, and also being in the early stages of my research work with digital archives. The module I teach, called Publishing Platforms, explores different approaches to digital-first open access multi-channel publishing. Without resorting to analog nostalgia or tech utopianism, I asked students to consider how the new hybrid landscape of blurry boundaries between printed and digital outputs can be used productively towards expanding the possibilities for working with and thinking through publishing as a critical design practice. The project involves an original proposal for a publication with a selection of public domain, Creative Commons, or anonymized online materials, which are oftentimes sourced from various online archive platforms. And the slide here just shows some of these archive resources that I share with students through a virtual platform we use called Arena. I asked students to pay careful attention to the architecture of these platforms, their data practices, how these impact users and designers who may want to work with archival materials. In devising this project, I have been very much influenced and inspired by the practices of other artists, designers, and researchers, including basically everyone on this panel today, in working with open source software, alternative platforms, and producing various forms of what might be called experimental publishing. I want to end with 2 examples of student work, which illustrate this final idea I kind of mentioned in the title slide, and I didn't really develop very much, the idea of the informed or reformed designer. So the first project is by Manon Veissière. Manon researched the French vernacular web of her own childhood and produced a wonderfully multifaceted hybrid project, including a print-on-demand publication, an interactive EPUB, distributed via the Internet Archive, as well as an online collection of GIF files characteristic of the time. Manon worked across 5 or 6 different platforms, ranging from commercial social media to hand-coded website poems and GIFs, to a hand-coded website of poems and GIFs which she made. She approached the platforms as a user, author, curator, designer, and the results challenge conventional categories and agencies. The second project is a new work from this term by Robbie Dawson. Robbie wanted to self-archive via publication a family WhatsApp chat that he'd been participating in throughout the pandemic. His project probed the limits of user agency when it comes to commercial software media platforms. First, he extracted raw data from his user account on WhatsApp. And then using a mix of free software and scripts, he recreated the sort of chat bubble format into a paginated document, which can then be printed on demand. He produced 2 separate volumes for print, one including chat messages and another including images. The images downloaded as the raw bulk data from WhatsApp were only available in this kind of scrambled, pixelated format, which in the end became a meaningful part of the aesthetics of the second volume of the publication. I'm just showing here the screenshots of as the work is still in progress, and I look forward to seeing the final result of this experimental practice of moving fluidly between user, designer, data wrangler, publication producer, later this term. So I think at this point I will stop and hand over to Tom and Marcell. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Lozana, and also thank you, Sophie and Ruth. So great to see many people in attendance. I'll start not to waste time. We have suggested as an entry point into our work around collective documenting, writing, and publishing our endeavors around pirate care and memory of the world, where that work has just stated. Pirate Care is a project that Valeria Graziano, Marcell, and I have convened with the objective initially to map and connect collective practices of organizing care, mutual aid, and solidarity that are emerging in response to the neoliberal crisis of care. Over the last couple of decades of neoliberal capitalism, the convergence of processes that include austerity cuts, the rollout of workfare, the attack on reproductive rights and criminalization of migration have denied that vital support to many. In response to that denial of care, which makes lives disposable, practices we have called pirate care are organizing to help migrants survive at sea and on land, provide pregnancy terminations where those are illegal, offer health support where institutions fail, self-organized childcare where public provision does not extend to everyone. Crucially, all these practices share a willingness to openly disobey laws and executive orders whenever these stand in the way of safety and solidarity, and politicize that disobedience to contest the status quo. That disobedience and that politicization is what defines them as pirate care, in our view. A pirate care practice is also providing access to knowledge where access is denied. This has been our practice, Marcell's and mine, over the last decade, spent building Memory of the World Shadow Library. Shadow libraries emerged out of the conjuncture where, amidst the expansion of access to written knowledge and culture through digital networks in the 90s, primarily public libraries, and then in the noughts, public libraries were denied by publishers from providing access to digital text in the form they provided to printed text, as the commodified access available to all members of society. This has robbed public libraries of their central role in the distribution of written culture and in the classification of knowledge, allowing Googles and Amazons to take over, imposing commodified limits to who has access to knowledge and culture in the digital realm. In response, the readers have organized to digitize and provide access to texts to fellow readers, thus creating shadow libraries with collections, catalogs, and librarians of their own, complementing in the digital domain the work of public libraries, the work that public libraries did in the world of print or in the domain of print. Our shadow library is one of many. I see that Marcell is in the background showing various shadow libraries. That was Monoscope just a moment ago, and this is Memory of the World. Our shadow library, Memory of the World, is one of many. It was specifically formalized around the idea of a peer-to-peer library and is a collective work of a number of librarians, each responsible for their own catalog and a collection. Central to our understanding of shadow libraries is the notion of custodianship, a notion we have hammered out in a collective letter written in response to the case brought against Library Genesis and Science Hub by Elsevier, the largest of academic publishers, where we have resorted to the simile with Little Prince who, upon encountering a businessman accumulating stars for the sheer purpose of owning more, suggests that he owns nothing but a rose and 2 volcanoes. He waters the rose and cleans the volcanoes. So to own means to be of use to that which one owns. This puts the notion of property, and in our case, intellectual property, on its head, and is a good definition what it means to be a custodian of knowledge commonly produced. And all knowledge is commonly produced. Initially, we didn't plan our work on pirate care to be focused on text. Yet, building on our work around amateur librarianship and custodianship of knowledge, developed while working on the Memory of the World Shadow Library, for Pirate Care project, we have eventually set the goal to activate collective learning processes from the situated knowledges of these practices, and to create learning materials that would work hand in hand with collections of references, collections of articles, pamphlets, archival documents that can be used in such learning processes. In this, we have been inspired by the phenomenon of #syllabi, that is, crowdsourced online syllabi created by social justice movements in response to situations of intense antagonism, such as #Ferguson syllabus that was created by or initiated by Marsha Chatelain in 2014 in response to the police killing of Michael Brown, or Gaming and Feminism syllabus, also created in 2014 in response to the Gamergate campaign of harassment against feminist writers in video game culture or game culture. We have written about this phenomenon in our article on learning from #syllabus in 2018 in States Machines collection of essays. There we have promised to develop a radical pedagogy approach that will help social justice initiatives write online syllabi of their own, and to do so in a technological framework that would allow that the syllabi, as well as the collections of texts that accompany them, be collectively created, easily preserved, and maintained independent from large digital platforms. The Pirate Care syllabus, which Marcell has shown on a couple of occasions in the background, was the first syllabus written on this framework. And with here, I'll stop and hand it over to Marcell to tell you more about Sendpoint's, the framework, as an experimental publishing platform. Marcell, off to you.
Yeah. It's just that the Zoom got so small that I couldn't unmute my microphone. Okay. And even more time. So yeah, it's I have like around like 10 minutes to present the software. And I think that in these kind of short presentations, it's very hard not to make that into a sales pitch. So let me try. And I'll just make one disclaimer. If you want to buy Sendpoints at the end of my presentation, I totally failed. So we believe, as Tommy was mentioning, that imaginary is a very important part of invitations to intervene into the world, especially when that invitation comes with a hope that the world will be a better place after we intervene together. Around 10 years ago, we made an intervention or an invitation, if you like, and that intervention, Memory of the World, was stating that a public library is free access to books for every member of society, a library catalog, and a librarian. And then it stated, with books ready to be shared, meticulously cataloged, everyone is librarian. When everyone is librarian, library is everywhere. Many people resonated, but only a dozen of us became amateur librarians, ready to share and meticulously catalog books. One could think that it must be a bad news to end up with only a dozen of librarians after you stated that everyone is a librarian. But the good news is that only a dozen of us, as you can see here listed, could serve tens of thousands of people with more than 156,600 books, and they're all meticulously cataloged. So what we learned is that introducing workflows, or even better, writing and deploying software, is a great narrative device to tell the story and invite others to do things together. So we had two main goals with the way how we wanted to set up the workflow for Pirate Care syllabus. And then later on, the whole platform we call Sendpoints these days. So for a very long time, we wanted to expand further from our librarian work to research and publishing. So after we made the idea and experience of public library, when we kind of made it convincing, we wanted to show where and how that kind of library can prove itself as inevitable, as just necessary. And another one was to rethink and revisit the levels of possible autonomy with and or around technology. So I will only be able to touch on those aspects through this demo, and I hope we'll have more time to do that, to discuss them. And for those aspects I'm talking about, the technological autonomy, I recently found a good opening. And in short, when we talk about distributed, federated, and shared infrastructures, I propose to talk about distributed resources versus distributed tech. So I think that we have too many distributed tech which don't deliver that many distributed shared resources. So let me just show you how that looked like with the Pirate Care. So what we had as a main concept with the Pirate Care is that we will do a syllabus. Then that syllabus will be supported with a number of topics. So the syllabus has topics, and then every topic would have a session. So we imagine that the session would be a description of the time we can organize to learn together. So in that sense, that was like a very simple thing, but also like in that sense, it is clearly that it has like a hierarchical kind of structure where syllabus would have or contain a number of topics, and then topics would contain a number of sessions. Another thing which I already mentioned was that that we wanted to make a library very well integrated with the whole workflow. So here you can see, like when you click on library, here is the library which is dedicated to the syllabus of Pirate Care, and then there is a way how it was kind of like integrated. So here you can see the references, for example, from this. So when you click on that, it goes straight into the library. And I'll just show you how that looks like from the admin side of the whole thing. So the whole syllabus was written collectively and saved and kept in a Git repository, which can be easily cloned and whatever, with a little kind of intervention. So when you're like on a syllabus Pirate Care, on the preview kind of version of the website, you would just get the I'll just show you that now. You will just get the header from where you can just edit any of the let's go here, any of the pages. So you go straight to the let me just do that. I have only 10 minutes and I'm not logged in. I'm sorry for that. What's up? But I love live because then you can also go quickly through that. So what happened is that you just go straight into the Gita where you can just like save and just use it. And here you can see that there is like a number of integrations or custom links which you can make. So let me just show you the one which I tried to show you. That was, I think, politicizing piracy. I know that well. So here you say that when you like do the bibliography, the ID of the book, you can get into the that was let me see, that was like here. So only through that you will just have something like a Chicago manual style. But then we moved forward, and I did, and now like Sean also like joined. We did something which is now called sendpoints, and just went much further than what we did with the pirate care. Maybe I just show you one thing here. So what we actually had already with the pirate care is that the whole website is like rendered into the offline ready. So you can actually use it from the USB disk. You can just go offline, and you can have both the library and the website, and you can use it. But then also what you get is that you get like at any given moment you get I think it was like shown, probably used by the same technology, the latest kind of development of CSS, so that you can do like a well-paginated PDF. So this is just like the latest PDF, well-paginated PDF, which just goes from that Git repository. So together with the website, you also get like a PDF. And then what we did is that developed the whole platform, which is called Sendpoints, and there were like few other projects which were developed on top of that. One is like machine listening. And here you can see that there is a curriculum instead of syllabus, and then the same like syllabus, it has topics, but then instead of sessions, it has experiments. Also, what you can hear, what you can see is like that there is like audio interviews which are integrated. So in that sense, it follows the same pattern. But what we kind of abstracted is that you don't need to use the syllabus topic session, but you can use that any kind of triadic tier structure. So in this case, it's curriculum topic sessions. You can go like poetic and say like it's a ship with decks and like cabins, or anything which would follow that. So I will just end up with the project, which was quite well finished in Sendpoints, and that's the issue of scientific journal, the Tao, which comes from the Nubian studies. And here you can see that basically it is like very conventional, and there are like many kind of media objects which follows this triadic tier structure. So here it's a journal which has issues, and then issues, just like any scientific journal, has like a number of articles. So what we did more in just like through the design and things like that is that we try to make very kind of visible the design. Let me just try to find some, no, I think that maybe here, yeah. So what we tried is like to keep the structure of the triadic, but also like the structure as in like, as in links. So there are like links which goes out, but then you also, there are like internal links, which would, for example, this one, which says article in this case. And then there is also like bibliography. And as you already kind of like, as you heard, the bibliography is coming just like with Pirate Care. It's coming all together with the whole issue. So I don't know if there is any other issue. I didn't hear of that, of scientific journal, which comes ready to be completely made offline. So you can put it on a USB disk, but also together with all of the references which are referred from that issue. And at the same time, at any given moment, you can actually get the PDF out of the website. And here it is. It has like also like the links, and as you can see, like well paginated. And then it followed it just like went with its own distribution channel. So it kind of passed all of these tests. And I will just stop here because we are already at 18 minutes. and just we can have more of the discussion later on.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom and Marcell. And I'll just pass on to Aymeric at this point, if that's okay.
Yeah, great. Thanks. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So,
Yes.
thank you very much. So thanks everyone for the presentation so far, and thanks for the invitation. I'm going to talk about experimental publishing, which is not a big surprise, of course. However, my personal take on it will be from the angle of the experimental publishing master at the Peace Institute of the Willem de Kooning Academy in Rotterdam that I've been running in the past years. So it's a 2 years master called experimental publishing. And I think that, yeah, indeed, like it was demonstrated in the event so far, this take on experimental publishing can be quite diverse. So this presentation does not aim at giving a definite understanding of experimental publishing, but explain to all of you what, in our context, this term means. So to start with, I think that, let's see, that if we talk about, whoops, hopla, make it pretty, about this notion of experimental publishing. The way we describe it often in the course is as such: making public and creating publics in the age of post-digital networks. Whoops. So that sounds great. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you would love to have as a poster or as a t-shirt. And it seems quite straightforward, but I think it would be worth unpacking, which is what I'm going to do. So what do we mean with that? We actually mean making public is quite easy somehow. Making public is very much this notion of the classic understanding of publishing, like making available information to a public using various methods of distribution and dissemination across various media. Where it starts to become interesting is when we add these questions of creating public. And here I have to credit Silvio Lorusso for that, because this addition came from a discussion I had with him at the beginning of the creation of the course, where for me, the notion of public, making public, and having an audience for it or creating public for the occasion was somehow conflated. But somehow Silvio managed to convince me that it was really not and should not be and not always conflated. And it's true that it was probably my wishful thinking that these two were always equivalent, but they are not. So eventually, we found this sort of addition useful to add to our definition of experimental publishing, also because it somehow forces to highlight the questions of intentions and agenda and purpose, the purpose of making public in the first place, and the need to activate, for instance, a collective response or collective reflection on what is being made public. And then finally, this in the age of post-digital networks is my own way of cherry picking from writings from Florian Kramer and Alessandro Ludovico, who have been writing quite extensively on the questions of post-digital and hybrid publishing. And one thing that I found very, very useful in this writing was very much this sort of relationship between old and new media, and how the dichotomy between these two is becoming increasingly, and maybe has been always obsolete in the first place. And that is much more interesting to combine, to think about the media differences, not in terms of old and new, but more in terms of conflicts or in terms of combination. And so this in the context of networks that are not just computer networks, but also human networks. So this is pretty much how the starting point of the foundation of how experimental publishing is approached in the course. Now, you may be wondering, like, concretely, what does that mean? And that would be an excellent way to indeed wonder about it. So I'm going to give you quickly 3 examples, not from the course, but just 3 examples that I think matches this definition. The first one is this a demo that was released, a demo for the Amiga computer that was released back in December. A demo is a small audiovisual, let's say, software that you can run on a computer, and then that's try to use your computer in this very specific way, trying to push the limit of sound and graphics and coding, sometimes with constraints to make the production. What is interesting with this particular demo was that it was announced first in December 2020, if I'm remembering correctly, or maybe a bit earlier, on YouTube as part of a video and a small software, the demo that you could download. But that was not the demo. It was in fact a flyer to announce that the next demo, this one, would be available, but to have access to it, you would have to send floppy disks. And for a very long moment, for a couple of months, this demo was only available through the sort of disk swapping scene. That was very much an attempt, or is maybe an attempt, I don't know, maybe it's me just speculating on that, to maybe revive the sort of disk swapping scene that you could be witnessed in the 90s computer scene, and that of course has very strong connection with mail art practices. Now, on a radically different approach, another form of experimental publishing, it would be for me like Vault 7, which was one of the publication from WikiLeaks from 2017. And this publication was very much about, it was a series publication, and the first one, actually the overall series, is to communicate about tools of cyber warfare. And the way it was put online was in the form of static collections of web pages. There were more than 8,000 or almost 8,000 web pages. There were almost 1,000 attachments of extra files, of software, of source code. And that was put online through peer-to-peer networks. What was interesting with it is that it was basically some sort of portable archive that had categorized all this information, and in which some of these massive documents were put together to form some narrative or to highlight some issues that was relevant to WikiLeaks. But it was also a call for others, for the audience, to do the rest, to also dive in their turn into this massive amount of information, and then to extract possible stories and possible information themselves. So a sort of a shared stash that would exist, some sort of static collection distributed over peer-to-peer network. And then finally, right again, like another radically different example would be a Nourishing Network, which is an ongoing project from the Austrian Net Culture Initiative Servus, and also the Rotterdam-based collective Vaya, which is in a way, you could say like it's a repository of text and articles about different forms of discourse circulation, contemporary issues, and network infrastructures from the people and the members of the community around these two organizations and collective. So you may think, okay, but this is just a website. And you're right, this is just a website. But the thing that is quite interesting about this project is that it's not only a website, because for the past month, all these texts have been circulating individually as a very nice dot matrix printed publication that has been circulating through post mail, where someone would receive as a gift one of these texts, would have time to engage with it and to read it, and then was kindly asked to then mail it to someone else. So for the past month, these texts and these discussions have been circulating through a really, like a rediscovered forms of network communication that of course changes the way you engage in you engage with the work. So these are for like example of experimental publishing that would fit this definition in my opinion. Now, one thing that is probably good to understand is that publishing can mean a lot of things, of course. And so I'm going to write it here, publishing as. So publishing as what? For us, I think the three dominant aspects of experimental publishing are publishing as aesthetics, publishing as politics, and publishing as technology. With these 3 points, I think this is where I usually try to draw a Venn diagram of XPub. But the point I'm trying to make here is that aesthetic is quite easy to understand in the context of publishing. This is something that is always interesting because it's about playing with media and formats. I mean, artist books have been, like an historical example of publishing as aesthetics in a way, not to reduce it in any way, but to say like this was an important part of it. Politics, however, touched about a part of publishing that maybe, more traditionally referred to as journalism, or maybe flirting with activism. And of course, collective organization. Whereas tech, for us, is an important factor that is often forgotten from these two aspects that are let's say quite easy to relate to the topic of publishing. But tech is one that we are really busy with, and specifically computer tech, because then when you start to talk about publishing as technology, then you need to take into account the question of tools. What are the tools that you're using for publishing? What is their story? What is their coming from? What is their underlying ideology? And of course, when you talk about technology, you also talk about the infrastructures that allow for the circulation of knowledge. And of course, that means that you will be talking about questions of intellectual property and licensing. And so that's something at XPub that we treat quite in depth. So these 3 things are really, let's say the three things where we try to develop XPub around, and mostly because I think, to go back to what I was saying earlier, this question of aesthetic, of course, is super interesting because it allows to create this sort of reflection on media, but with the medium themselves or itself, let's say. Technology allows to engage with questions of autonomy, the question of what autonomy and control means in the context of network publishing nowadays. And that was very well illustrated by the previous presentation. And eventually, for the question of politics, we get back to this question of intention and purpose, and what is the drive, what is the articulation of publishing, and why doing it into first place. So XPub is all about trying to turn all this into a method of artistic research and critical practice. The way we are doing that is over 2 years' time. Hop, another beautiful diagram. Is by in the first year, trying to split the year into 3 trimesters. And for each of these trimesters, we are running what we call special issues. So a special issue is essentially an excuse for us, staff and student and guest and collaborator, collaborating partner organization or collective, to look into one specific issue and to figure out what's the best way to create a publication about this. And of course, we take the term publication in a very broad understanding, as you may have guessed now. And this way, it gives us a sort of freedom to really engage with the materiality of the issues, the discourse, what it actually means, and it eventually leads to this publication. A publication that you can find a repository here on the issue.xpub.nil mini website. And I'm going to just show, like, very briefly, because we're super short on time, 2 of them, or 3, let's say 3. So this is the recent one from last trimester, issue 14, that started. It started essentially as a challenge that we got, or that we claimed, to produce the unreleased 7 issues of Situationist Time that was started by Jacqueline de Jong. and that never got released in the end. Citoyenne's time stopped at issue 60, issue 6, and there was material gathered for issue 7, but it was never released. So it was our starting point. Our starting point with a collaborator page not found in Dena and Lilia Pereira, who is an artist and researcher working on questions of game and politics and gender, to see like what would be, like the sort of a take that we could take on questions of labor and automation and psychogeography in relationship to what Jacqueline de Dion had been already busy with, this series of situationist time. And eventually the student came up with this sort of psychogeographic series of game that would allow you to explore the city, using the city in a way to, as a kind of publishing medium. I don't want to get too much into details because of the time, so I'm going to jump right away into another publication so you get a little bit of an idea of the scope of the work that we do. This time for this publication, the publication was a PCB. We were talking about the question of interfacing. What is an interface? What does it mean to actually have input and output? What is a process? And the best way to, I think, to embody and to materialize this was to develop a sort of modular synthesizer. So the publication is essentially like distributed in a vinyl sleeve and with manual for each of these different modules, and it can be assembled into all sorts of different devices that could be used to perform and whatever the student wanted to express in terms of what input and output and processing meant for them. And then for the launch we had, so yeah, I hope I'm not going to make everyone sad by showing such kind of popular event in times of pandemic, but the launch was attended in this very crowded place at the Player in Rotterdam, where everyone could try the modules and see how they would work together. So this was the publication. And then finally, another example would be a bed, a chair, and a table. That was an attempt to create an archive about the whole sort of the culture around a squat or ex-squat in Rotterdam. That has a very long history, and it was very, very instrumental in the development of urban culture in Rotterdam. And that, for various reasons, has been increasingly threatened to disappear. And the special issue was very much about trying to document this, to provide a permanent online space for this history to exist, and at the same time create a publication that would capture interviews and snapshots about this whatever happened around this squat. Now, and I'm getting quite close to the end now. Once the first year students are done with this special issue project, they move on into the second year. The second year is essentially, let's say, divided into 3 as well. The first one is the project proposal. And trimester 2, they have to finish their thesis. And trimester 3, they do have to come up with their project. And this time, like in theory, the ideal situation we want to reach is that through this sort of collective practices that they experience in the first year, they are eventually able to derive their own interest, their own form of collaboration, to set up, like what is the issue for them and what is the topic they would like to make public and what would be the means to do it. And that's how they eventually collaborate with a project that relates to that. We do have another project, another website for these, which is called project.expub.nl. Once again, I really invite you to come and have a look if you're interested after the presentation, because I can't go in depth with any of these. I'm just going to show you a couple of these graduation projects so you can understand maybe the kind of work that we're doing. And for instance, Instant Warnet from Natasha Berting is a live action role-playing game which pokes and prods at networks of harassments on social media. In this collective performance, you are invited to assume fictional characters on the massively multiplayer arena of Instagram with the goal of disrupting and diffusing some of its more hostile practices and spaces. Composed entirely of found tactics, scenarios, and language used by the world's most cunning trolls, buzzers, and company operative, Instant Warnet is an experiment which aims to flip the script on online toxicity. Instead of looking away or logging off, players are encouraged to live voraciously through their characters, using performance as a mode of talking back and reclaiming space on the platform. As you can see, this project was developed, oops, this is getting a bit funny here, published under the peer production license. So this is just a footnote in my presentation to say that when I'm talking about free culture license, I'm not talking necessarily literally about free culture licenses, but that the writing of licenses and working with less common licenses is also something we're really looking into quite closely. Of course, the thesis that the students are making are also a way to reflect on their work. So once again, please have a look. If something is interesting, a project is interesting, you will most likely find as well a thesis that will go in depth and reflect on the work of the student. Another work I wanted to maybe show is the Bootleg Library. I wanted to show it because I know that the previous presentation could resonate with this strongly, also because we had Marcell as a past guest in the course. The Bootleg Library is a particular situated social infrastructure. It operates from the understanding that a library is a collection of the text containing within it, and the readers collected around them. A reciprocal, self-reflective relationship between the text and the readers produces sociability. A bootleg is an unauthorized copy of a source publication. Bootlegging is a strategy by which texts acquire diversity, resisting singularity, and representing readers. Another one that I would wanted to show is Sister Papyri Magica, which is a project that unfolds the phenomenon of gender exclusion in male-dominated tech environment, aiming to document, discuss, and activate a variety of feminist practices that respond to this issue. The Sister Papyri Magica website enables a playful navigation to a collection of stories and practices that are gathered in a growing editable wiki. Aided by the early web magic of hyperlinks, one may discover documentation of sexist incidents on tech feminist hacker project, wiki pages to write their versions of stories, or even dead ends. A fictional context of sorcery provides a game-like atmosphere, but is also tactically used. On the one hand, the witch as an excluded figure symbolizes female strength that challenges patriarchal systems. On the other hand, witchcraft is a theme ever present in the geek culture, proposing that technology has a source of magical power that one can harness for their own sense of agency and empowerment. And finally, I wanted to also maybe briefly mention the work of Alice Strait. So is it time to eat, or is there no more time to eat? Is an extensive review of the most prominent techno-solutionist creation in terms of food. It manifests itself into a desktop film and essay alongside of an archive of images, articles, videos, and more, which together deconstruct the culture of future food born in the valley of technological quick fixes. The work takes a closer look at the culture around the techno-solutionist ideology and the role of meal replacement within societies, which value the authoritative roles of tech innovators and their potential to impact the way humans live. To conclude, I want to say that, of course, some of you may see that, okay, but experimental publishing is nothing really new. And I have to say, yeah, and it's true, it's new. And it's by design not new, in the sense that we are really not trying to here coin somehow a new word or try to develop a new practice, but in fact find an interesting framework for all sorts of relevant strategies for art and culture production that needs to be constantly reactivated or revitalized in this sort of environment in which novelty, also in the art, is the main driving factor, unfortunately. And that always goes at the detriment of let's say, of a productive or generative forms of solidarity that I think artists and designers should be instrumental in helping shape. So that's why when we talk about Expub, we always understand that more as a means to an end as opposed to just an end in itself. And in a way, Expub is almost like a MacGuffin. It is a plot device that helps the narrative move forward, but this is just an excuse, because for us, all these different ways of working together on this thematic is an attempt to, yeah, I would say to work on questions of social change. Voilà. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Marcell and Tom and Aymeric and Karen for all of your wonderful presentations today. Maybe Sophie, just if I can point to you to pinlight all of us. I don't know what our audience is seeing, but I think it will be nice if we can kind of all be seen on the screen. I am like, my head is just full of so many questions and ideas. These were such interesting presentations, very diverse, but I definitely think there were so many kind of interesting touch points, particularly in the end, Aymeric, I was just laughing to myself seeing that you're mentioning Simon Brown's project from last year's XPub, whom I invited to actually give a guest talk in my course this term. So I definitely think there's like lots of interesting intersections. Guess what? I'm giving everyone like a little bit of time to sort of catch up, have a breath, and think about questions, because I would like to encourage the panelists to also ask questions to each other. I might start with the question to Ruth, actually, because it might just sort of give a bit of a background to why we put this whole thing together, and kind of try to tie up some ends. Ruth, is that okay? Should I go with my question to you?
That's good. If I got my microphone on, yeah.
Yeah, great. So my question is, as an educator, and I think we had a lot of pedagogical kind of touch points in all the presentations so far. What do you think a panel like this can add to graphic or typographic design discourse, specifically when thinking back to the debates that rolls up around the 80s and 90s, around magazines like Emigre, and also some of the projects we talked about earlier, like the Whole Earth Catalog, the artistic publications, and then zooming forward to the much more recent examples that Aymeric showed, and also the projects that Tom and Marcell highlighted?
Yeah, I think it's really a good question, because this comes up quite a lot in my department when we talk about what graphic communication is and what communication design is, and the emergence of information design as an area distinctively different possibly from book design, and the importance for me of Emigre. And I guess when I first looked at Emigre and the debates that went around that magazine, it's a Californian magazine produced in the 1980s and 90s. For those of you that don't know, it's really easy to look up. There was a lot of debate about the way that magazine looked typographically and in terms of page layout. I think Aymeric's point about old media and new media is really important here, because this is a print-based magazine primarily. And it caused a lot of debate within graphic and typographic design discourse about the idea of legibility and readability of text-based language. And what struck me in the discussions and debates that sort of raged around that magazine at that time was there was no mention, virtually no mention, of art practices and publication practices that have been happening back in the 60s, 20 years before that. And it was just so, for me, obvious that these were precursors to what Emigre was picking up on at that point when Apple Macintosh desktop publishing tools became available. They were doing the same thing. They were certainly referring to the same theoretical background in the experiments, but no mention of these art practices, and almost a sort of deliberate refusal to engage with them because they were art. And so because they're art, they're not design, so we won't refer to them. And yet they were essentially important, I felt, to the understanding of that move in the 80s and 90s by that group of designers in California. They were type designers, they were also document designers. And then moving forwards, I feel that Emigre was, it existed as a print-based thing. It was predicting a shift, just in the same way that the Whole Earth Catalog was predicting a shift. These are avant-garde publications that are looking forward to what's coming up next. And that's why they're interesting to me, that they absolutely predicted the shift, as did Carolee Schneemann, possibly. I don't know, I think people practice at the moment when they do things in this kind of iterative, multifaceted way, and they get these publications, a really good example of how people work. And maybe Dan Graham, these artists weren't necessarily knowing where that was going to go, but it was sort of captured by Emigre, Whole Earth Catalog, amongst this kind of environment of a shift happening. And I think in order to understand many of the practices now, you still need to look back. And this isn't a lineage that only goes back to the 60s. It goes much further back than that. You know, Lawrence Stern, Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, many experimental writings and, you know, poetry, calligrams, etc. These are all referring to the same sort of theoretical lineage. So that's why, for me, from a point of view of a design school, it's important to integrate these discussions within the consideration of graphic communication. And just one last thing, I think it's really important because nobody's much shown that the publish on demand documents, everybody's shown these sort of dynamic interfaces that are created through these new publishing ex-pub practices. But with Lozana's teaching, and I think also with Aymeric's teaching, you're referencing physical objects too. So when I'm having a discussion with Rick Poyner in my department, he says, where's the graphic communication? There is still a physical form here, and it's a relational form that's going on, and it's shifted the way graphic communication looks nowadays, you know, very importantly. And the designers, the student designers in my department have to come on board with that. And it's a learning curve, you know, because they're traditional book designers. And yet Lozana's project is really excellent in kind of talking to them about what's appropriate as a sort of graphic form that accompanies this dynamic digital, you know, completely moving situation that they're publishing into. So I think that's all I want to say. I've said quite a lot. I'm not sure if it made that much sense, but hopefully someone else can follow on.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. That's great. I think we might be having some kind of a viewing problem. I don't know if Sophie can solve it somehow, but Sophie has the kind of moderating, I think, capabilities on this call. But I would encourage people, if you're only seeing one person, and specifically a person who is not speaking, you might be able to just change the view yourself. Like there should be like a view button at the top right corner. Sorry. Okay, well, someone can see us all, so obviously it's not like a problem for everyone. Okay, just to ignoring these like technical issues. Thanks so much, Ruth, for your remarks. Indeed, I think lots of interesting points around materiality there. And I mean, I want to also mention that what I love about projects like the Sandpoints platform that Tom and Marcell shared is that it can automatically produce a PDF, like actually a very beautiful PDF. And this whole idea of like designing by instruction, which, you know, goes back to many, many years ago, even before the internet, like that goes, I think, into the design of these types of what might seem like a very dynamic interactive interface, but it is a piece of graphic communication, and it can be rendered in a browser, it can be rendered as a PDF, it can be printed. Not to mention the fact that materiality, I think, is a really tricky thing, because maybe as Aymeric's example showed, I mean, we can talk about digital materiality, right? Like all of these diskettes or floppies or modular syncs. I mean, there is a very heavy duty materiality in there, but I won't go into that whole discussion. I think
just jump in with a question. I'm waiting for questions to come in from the audience, but I'm going to ask a quick question to Karen, because I want to get back to her presentation, because it was sort of stood alone really at the beginning. She was very much looking at printed forms and also talking about the archive and the categorization of things. And I just wanted to ask Karen, in your work at Tate, did you find it interesting that items that you consider to be iterations of the same work might be catalogued and separated by their designation into the library or the archive?
Well, that's the kind of, I guess, is the formulation of the research itself, because I mean, in some ways, the research troubles this notion of what publishing might stand for within collecting institutions such as Tate. And obviously, you know, there's a certain logic that, you know, publishing dictates, because in general terms that they come in as book forms, and so therefore they're understood as such. But because they have a very specific relationship to the archives at Tate, this kind of quite, you know, fair enough notion is problematized immediately, because there's so many publications in archives at Tate. So therefore you might be looking at the same thing in the library, and it's classified completely differently to how it's classified within the archive. I think by and large, I found that the materials that I was researching weren't really catalogued at all. I mean, if anything, they were just listed as by their title.
And how about correspondences that wouldn't, like a private publication of something that you would have identified as part of the work, yet it was never made specifically public, that it might have been a private correspondence between two people, but historically it becomes part of your understanding of a bigger work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at something at the moment that's part of a sort of unfinished publication that Boges Press made, that Schneemann contributed to, that I'm going to be doing some research in the next few months writing about that. And I think in a way it's a really useful example because it's essentially a standalone artwork. And so, I mean, I guess my question is about, like, what happens if we start to redesignate these materials, particularly in relationship to how we might consider an artist's estate now. So someone like Schneemann in particular is going through quite a large reappraisal of her practice, and publishing is featuring quite largely within that reappraisal. Whereas previously it hasn't, and you know, in some respects I'm broadly contributing to that, but I also feel like there's obviously things that you create problems when you start to redesignate materials as artwork, as much as you might, as much as it might expose those materials to a broader audience. By kind of collectively deciding to change the material reality of that object, I think, you know, you're creating something that is, you know, a hybrid object within something which is largely analog. And yeah, I mean, I think it raises a huge amount of conceptual questions around notions of agency, particularly to the artist, but also agency to the researcher or the curator, in terms of where we might decide that these things are best suited, I suppose. I mean, I think if you're thinking about it from a display perspective, obviously these things are mutable and they can materialize wherever you decide to place them. But in terms of what you actually describe that object as within, you know, a catalogue, then that fixes it in a vastly different way, which is something that's interesting with the digital archive of artist publishing, because it allows for a certain amount of mutability, and that you're not actually moving something from one thing to another, you're just creating the connections between them, which in a way is sort of where my interests are more located. Sorry, did that answer?
Yeah, no, that was great, really interesting. I mean, I find from a design point of view myself, when I look as a design trained person at some of these works, first time I looked at Dan Graham's Homes for America, I saw things that were just they're not included in the art historical accounts of the piece because they seem insignificant, but they're crucially important to the understanding of the piece, because the way in which you can't, for instance, view them as a single object because they're published in such a way that they begin on a recto. You know, you then have to turn the page in order to see the next piece of the work. So many times that piece is reproduced wrongly in books. So you can view it as a single spread. That's really important to understanding the dynamic action of that work. And so I think, you know, like Karen's experience of working in the archive, and actually, you know, so many people I think you have to go and look at the stuff. You really have to go and look. You can't just look in books at this. You have to go and look at the things. And so very important to have these things available and accessible to people. And then you get back to that whole thing of categorization and how you do get to these things in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly, I mean, thinking about how this connects to Marcell and to all the other presenters is around, you know, increasing the ways in which you might intervene or find yourself amongst these materials. And so for me, it's just a basic categorization is a start. You know, you can get so kind of bound up between the processes of thinking about what artist publishing means, and then, you know, find that someone's completely undoing that anyway in another type of collection. Yeah. And so that, you know, it's always contested in one, you know, particular environment or another. And so
I think we have somebody from the audience, Louisa Rattray has put us, it's a question about what we're talking about, so I'm just going to insert it here. She explains on this point of materiality and the idea of publishing as practice. She's referring to whether or not the process is the work, or if it's something about a process versus the form, the publication, or are they collapsed into one? And I think, Louisa, I hope we're kind of getting to this, you know, it is a process, but it is still, there is a formal dimension to this still, if you look at the earlier works. But then I'm going to stop talking now, because I think the more dynamic works are more process, clearly process, but there still is a formal dimension to this.
Yeah, maybe I can pick up a little bit from this, because I'm also interested in this question. I'm actually going to post it in the kind of answered section in the Q&A, so people can see that question. I would also like to say that we have technically 2 minutes official time left, but I think we might extend at least 5 or 10 minutes if people want to hang around. So just to continue on this idea of the process, I might want to go back to what Aymeric was talking about with their view of experimental publishing as more than you know, a kind of end. It's more a means to an end. It's more a processual kind of endeavor, and maybe to tie it back into this kind of discourse around pedagogy and design. Aymeric, would you speak a little bit briefly about how do you get designers on board with this? I assume quite a lot of people who apply to this program are coming from a design background. Do you think you know, there is something new that requires a bit of a mental shift in this idea of like, we need to be thinking processually rather than like you just have like a fixed outcome? If you might want to speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, I can say something briefly. No, it's true that it requires a little bit of unlearning, a lot of unlearning at first, but it's also something that we realized is that there was a huge interest and demand and eagerness to do this unlearning. And maybe with what I'm saying now, I'm going to maybe also partly answer to some of the other questions as well, because I saw someone were talking about the state of the publishing industry and the digital publishing a couple of years ago, and how this stuff is going on right now. And also these questions of process, and also this question of how you can collectively learn together, what's the most efficient way to work together. And what we see is that, in fact, art schools, I mean, art academies, and I guess to some extent universities as well, have been completely shaped by this question of markets, economies, and division of labor, to the point where the role of an artist and a designer or programmer has been reduced to a little, let's say, gear into a very specific assembly line. And if we look at the early days of digital publishing and hybrid publishing, this is how it was understood as well, as you would have a sort of single form that would automatically turn into beautiful online forms and printed form and so on and so forth. Always in the perspective of isolating, not quite understanding the whole pipeline, not quite understanding what was going on, the whole purpose, but just know you are in your assembly line and you do one thing well, and this is your job. And this is what art and let's say graphic design has been reduced to in the context of publishing in the past years. And what we see is that there is a huge resistance happening right now to go back to collective forms of production, also using modes of productions, of modes of organization as an artistic medium in itself, to say that we don't have to follow a certain hierarchical system. We don't have to produce a book or produce a website or produce software in such or such a way. These means and logistics are also a medium in themselves that needs to be manipulated. So I think that from an educational perspective, we get a lot of people at Expub that come specifically for this. They have acquired skills at their bachelor or through their professional experience beforehand, but clearly they are suffering from this isolation. They are suffering from the tools of the trade. They are suffering from a certain ways of producing content and how to publish nowadays. And that's really not what motivated them to do graphic design or art in the first place. So Expub and other courses become, I think, more interesting in that case, because they try to approach it from this unlearning perspective and then to redefine and restarting almost from scratch. And to go back to the discussion between Garrett and Ruth very briefly, one thing I wanted to say as well is that again, the richness is from making sure the different media and the different objects that are not compromising, that there is not some sort of consensus, or there is not some sort of middle point that needs to be found into different objects that are being published. And that's why I think, let's say, more historical approaches of underground publishing, or from looking at the Aspen project, for instance, are interesting, or even Fluxus, because they are not compromising on anything. And this is where we need to go today, to go back to publishing without compromising on the process, the tools, and the media.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think, because I'm just keen to sort of get in as many questions from the audience as I can in the next few minutes, there's one other question I think is nice, and I kind of like a little bit, continuing in this direction. It's from an anonymous attendee, so I'm just going to read it out. Thanks so much for the wonderful presentations. I was wondering how the Sandpoint software making process triggered thoughts and ideas around structuring learning materials. So maybe Tom and Marcell, if you don't mind, speaking a bit more to that. And I'm also interested in this idea of the Sandpoint's platform or workflow, or however you want to call it, how that kind of fundamentally questions our ideas of like how referencing works, and maybe even like going back to old school ideas of hypertext and Ted Nelson, and sort of embedding in the references into the project as a whole, being able to view it offline, etc. So maybe if you don't mind speaking a bit more about that point around the intersection of learning and this kind of structure of the software.
Marcell, can
relate. I'm sorry.
Do you want to expand on the latter part of the question?
Yeah,
on hypertext.
I can. Yeah.
Go.
I mean, I think that there is like a. I think that there is a lot of kind of like kind of like revisiting the ideas what backlink could mean, and in which way it can help people thinking. I don't know, like Rome research, for example, is like quite popular these days, the startup, venture capital driven, whatever. And Sandpoints in that sense has kind of prominently or less prominently the support for backlinks, structures and things like that. But what I found much more kind of relevant and important is that we try to name the labor. We try to basically not to flatten down and say like everyone can do everything. Yes, there is like software tools can help us to, I don't know, like publish the moment when we write something in that sense. Software tools can help us to do cataloging much easier than how cataloging was like done before. Git in that sense can help us kind of seamlessly do some kind of bureaucracy. So in that sense that we can see who did what, when, and things like that. So for me, I think that what we try to do is to name the labor, to recognize the labor, and to try to challenge the idea of the individual author through that, but at the same time not to try to forget. So in that sense, let's recognize who's doing which work, so in that sense, like author should be the last one and the least interesting one. Editor, helping people, librarians, and all kind of roles which are usually kind of completely kind of organized by capital. I think that this is where we would like to intervene and see that done in some different way, and hopefully like sustainable. And in terms of the structures and the thought processes, just in terms of design, we try to keep the redundancy in always reminding people what you are looking into, where it sits, and in that sense also not to try to go into too much of complexity. So there is a constraint here. It's a triad. You can't do 4. You don't do 2. You do 3. 2 level of depth. And we were thinking a lot about that, and we can talk for like a very long time on these as a thought processes. But I would go back and say that labor and roles are much more kind of important for us at this moment. Tommy, maybe you can expand more.
Yeah, and not much on concerning the structure of learning materials, but what we've or where we started from is that a syllabus is sort of a contract between a teacher and students. In that sense, it's a social contract. It lines out not only what is being learned, but how it's being learned. And in our experience creating the syllabus, it's a collective syllabus. We've basically understood that to create a collective syllabus, you need a longer collective process to come to a joint understanding of what it is that that body of knowledge is. And then it's also an act of empowerment of the other to be able to teach very specific knowledge that the other person brings to the table. So unfortunately, we were planning to create, to organize a learning or summer camp last year, but it didn't, for obvious reasons, come together, and invite their people to self-select what do they want to teach from that syllabus, but collectively with others. No? So in a way, it very much works on the idea that there is no hard distinction between the teacher and the learner, and that process is very much an encounter around proposal for learning. So in our hierarchy, session is fundamentally a proposal for learning that defines time, the material, the format, and playing out through that collective encounter.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And on that note of collective encounter, I think we're going to have to draw the panel, the evening to an end. We've gone slightly over. I'm sorry to people who find that frustrating, but it was just very interesting. We tried to get in as many of the questions from the Q&A as possible. There are still some not answered, but we have emails, so we can or put things up on the site. We'll deal with that. But thank you. I just want to say thank you to the Centre for Book Cultures and Publishing for hosting this event tonight. And I hope the audience has found it interesting. Thank you to all our fantastic speakers for your contributions and for coming together in this panel. It's been a very interesting set of people positioned together, I think. So Lozana, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief because we want to be wrapping up, but just to also address one question in the audience, which was around, how can we share more of this knowledge? Like sometimes things are very fragmented. And I think with this particular panel, that's in a way what I tried to do is connect quite a few different networks of people that I know through different channels, but oftentimes they're not necessarily put in conversation. How to keep in touch with all of this, especially if you're a newcomer to the scene. I don't like to think of it as a scene. I like to think of it as a kind of community. Follow any one of us, I guess, who is here online, some kind of channel. I think most of us are on various social media networks. Stay up to date with CBCP newsletters. I'm sure Sophie will mention more of that. We hope to have more of these kinds of events in the future. So yeah, I hope it was interesting for everyone. It was really interesting for me, and I hope we all get to continue the conversation soon, maybe even live at some point in the next year or so. Thank you, and I hand over to Sophie now.
Thank you. Just very quickly from the Centre for Book Cultures and Publishing, I'd like to extend my warmest thanks to Lozana and Ruth for organising this, and to our wonderful panellists for your fascinating presentations, and also to say to our attendees, thank you for your questions and reflections. They've been really great as well. And to reiterate, we would like to keep in touch, keep you updated on this project and where it's going, and also, the many other things that we're up to in the centre. So we'll be sending you an email after the event, and I will have a little form at the bottom, so if you want to be updated on this project and also sign up to our newsletter, then that'd be wonderful. So thank you very much to all.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a nice evening. Bye.
Nice evening.
Bye.
Ciao.
Sophie, you need to close the webinar.
I was actually Ruth, so I need to switch off the webinar. Is that, sorry,
Yeah.
I keep on forgetting that that's what I need to do. All right, well, thank you very much and see you all soon and speak soon.
Yes, thank you. Bye, Sophie.
Bye.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Aymeric. Lozana.
Bye.